Daren Jaime here with you. I want to let you know Latino Justice is an organization that's actually working with boots on the ground to create a more just society by using the challenging rule of law to secure transformative, equitable, and accessible justice by empowering the community as well as fostering leadership through advocacy and education. And the organization itself just recently released a narrative series that's actually discussing the way of police, prosecutors, and courts have historically targeted people of color, and particularly in the area of incarceration for our country. And joining us now to talk a little bit more about this is a very capable person, one who knows a lot about this area, the President General Counsel of Latino Justice, and that is Juan Cartagena. And we thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Darren. Thank you for having me.
Hey, listen, it's a very important conversation, and thank you for taking the time out to hang out with us and have this conversation. But when we talk about, social justice, of course, we see the death of George Floyd, and that is one aspect of social justice, the fight against police brutality. But, Latino justice has had boots on the ground in a variety of different areas. So for somebody who doesn't know about Latino justice, first of all, let's talk about that.
Sure, thank you. So our original name is the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund. We were born right here in New York City in 1972. When we first started opening our doors, there was very much total exclusion of Puerto Ricans from civic life in New York City, from government jobs, from private sector jobs. Puerto Ricans in New York City were the largest number of people who've come from Latin America at that time. Like 80% of the entire city was Puerto Rican of all the Latinos. But little by little, that diversity started changing, right? We started having influxes from other countries in the Caribbean, Dominican populations, of course, Colombian, Ecuadorian. We see all the diversity of the Latin American neighborhoods in the Caribbean and in Central South America, all in New York City. So when we started, this was a very narrow focus to use the law that allowed us to open doors with Puerto Ricans at the front and lead, because Puerto Ricans had citizenship granted by Congress back in the early 1900s. And little by little, we started opening these doors. By the way, and among the doors that we opened early on was the New York City Police Department. Mm-hmm. We had to sue NYPD multiple times because they wouldn't hire Blacks and Latinos, or Blacks and Puerto Ricans. They had height requirements that certain people couldn't meet, especially Latino populations. They had tests that had nothing to do with policing, that stopped people from becoming police officers or becoming sergeants. So for our early opening doors from the 72 throughout the early 80s, we were doing successful work to integrate the police department. Over time, of course, we do work on every area now. Today, we work on voting rights, immigrants' rights, economic justice, that is the right of workers. We also do challenging the consequences of the criminal justice system in multiple ways today, in different parts of the country. And we still provide assistance to people who want to become lawyers. And we've been doing that since 1972.
Yeah. Well, talk to us about this. When you talk about taking on the NYPD, obviously, we've seen recently the NYPD really fight back, saying that they're being unfairly targeted during such a time as this, particularly when we talk about these protests that have occurred. Your thoughts on what you're seeing out there with regards to NYPD and the area of accountability?
Okay, two big things, right? One is accountability, which is a decade-long conversation we've been having in communities, in the African-American community, in the Latino community, and anybody who knows anything about New York City, right? We could have been talking about the same issues back in the 1960s at the height of both the Young Lords and the Black Panthers, at the height of unrest to demand equality, at the height of the opposition to the Vietnam War, at the height of the labor movement and the boycott of grapes out in the West Coast with Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers. In that period of our history, these same episodes of outrageous police brutality were happening every day. And we could have easily had the same kind of reforms that we're talking about today. So accountability is a long process that now, because of what's happening in this country, only in the last 3 weeks, the culmination of so much outrageous violence, state-sponsored violence against Black folk, is exactly now positioning us to have perhaps drastic changes in how we think about policing. So that's the accountability piece. And there's more to talk about that and more to figure out what that means. But also when it comes to the integration of the police force, the overall history of the police force in New York City, and how police officers now, or I should say, how their unions are saying that we're also being discriminated against by the police, by government and the public. Well, the fact of the matter is, what's different from the 60s and today is we have video footage like multiple ways and multiple times, thousands and thousands of hours of footage showing provoking behavior by police against peaceful protesters. Now, I fully understand that policing is not an easy job. I fully understand that there are times in which we have opportunities to make sure we can address those issues. But for police officers to now claim that they're being the victims when all the video evidence is demonstrating something different, it's a pretty difficult thing for me to accept.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I know a lot of conversation will continue to be had about NYPD relations and, going back and forth between police community relations, which are very integral in order for, the community to be able to work. But let me ask a question I've been asking throughout the course of this show. When it comes to 50A, which has been submitted by the governor as part of legislation, his backing 50A, and then also the race baiting, making that a charge here in New York, in New York State. I want to get your thoughts on that, and what do you think about the governor's reform legislation?
Number one, we've been in favor of the elimination, complete repeal, not partial, complete repeal of 50A for many years. I've stood alongside Gwen Carr, the mother of Eric Garner, talking about these issues when Pantaleo, the officer, was finally facing disciplinary charges for the first time, 5 years after the death of Eric Garner. And she was able to sit in an administrative courtroom and listen to his testimony for the first time, because he was never held to account. He was never forced to testify about what happened. So he did. And her position was that 50A shields unnecessarily police misconduct. We didn't know at the time of the killing of Eric Garner that this particular officer had 4 substantiated, not complaints, simple, but substantiated complaints of excessive use of force in his files, and that nobody can know about it. Not you as a member of the press, Daren, nor me as an attorney, nor the family of Mr. Garner. So in his memory, I recently said, as recently as last week, we should definitely repeal all of 50A. It looks like both houses in Albany have passed it. Now we'll see if the governor does signs it very soon, and that's what we're looking forward to.
Yeah, yeah.
Your other point was about race-based, is that the use of race baiting on phone calls to the police?
Right.
Yeah. By all means. When people are using race to fictitiously come up with reasons to then get police involved in what is just simple engagement with people, neighbors and others, that's an abusive process. That's an abuse of government resources, and it should be dealt with.
Yeah.
Because the last thing we need is for police to be more engaged in what they are. And that goes to the heart, Daren, of what you and I have already started talking about, right? We're at a point in which not only this city, New York City has been talking about these issues about excessive policing for a long time, a long, long time. But like the rest of the country is now recognizing, why do we need so many police in your face all the time? And you increase the number of engagements between police and civilians, and you still haven't fixed the problem of policing in general, then all you're doing is exacerbating the risk that something will go wrong. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what's been happening in places like New York, in places like Chicago, Los Angeles, those kind of places.
Well, Juan, I'm probably going to date myself here, right? And you'll probably know when I
don't think you're going to be more than me, man. But go ahead.
Well, when I first got behind the anchor desk at BronxNet, one of the major cases that I covered was that of Anthony Baez and Francis Livoti. And right. I do remember it was a Friday night, and it was a Friday night somewhere around 6 o'clock, and Judge Gerald Scheinlein came down with the verdict and said that he did find that Mr. Livoti had not given the truth. However, he did not find enough evidence for conviction, and hence Francis Livoti was able to walk. I look at that, and then I think about Eric Garner. and you know, the Lavoti case, bias, that's a chokehold. Garner, that's a chokehold. Now we're sitting out here and we're watching George Floyd, and that's literally watching a knee to the neck and being choked out. And so the question that I have is like, how much can we say significantly has changed when I just given you a timeline of, you know, just over the course of the last 20-some years?
You're right. Virtually nothing has changed. And that's because accountability for police misconduct of this kind of outrageous level of misconduct, complete disregard of humanity, really, complete disregard of procedures. Pantaleo allegedly was operating under a system that outlawed, according to the manual, chokeholds. Chauvin out there in Minneapolis apparently put a knee to Mr. Floyd's neck, and apparently that's not authorized according to their own training manuals. It doesn't really make a difference. At the end of the day, to change this culture, we have to change the levels of accountability. So for example, if I'm the supervisor of a police force and one of my members has had 4, not 1, 4 substantiated cases of abuse of force against him or her, then what am I doing? Deploying this person out in the street repeatedly. Why aren't I putting a different kind of check on this kind of behavior? 2, if Pantaleo in Garner case or in Lavati in the Anthony Baez case were forced to pay a portion of the damages, the millions of dollars that the city has had to pay to the families of both Eric Garner and to Anthony Baez's family, just a portion out of their own pension, they might have a different take about how they act when it comes to the next engagement with civilians. And 3, this again goes to the heart of what you just said before. You know, this is not only Lavati was at least brought to account in a courtroom. Garner, Pantaleo and Garner wasn't even brought to a courtroom. He was brought to an administrative court for discipline about whether or not he was going to lose X number of vacation days for what he did to Mr. Garner. That was the only issue in that case.
Right.
So there are, Daren, there are places in this country. I can give you Bakersfield, California off the top of my head. It's like ground zero for the killing of Latino unarmed men by Bakersfield police and Kern County police. They don't even bring charges in court against these police officers. There's 1 or 2 police officers in Bakersfield who have literally, at their own hands, killed 3 civilians. And they're still on the force. They don't even lose a day's pay. And the only investigation, Daren, is internal by the police department. And every time, they conclude that the homicide was justified. So we don't even have prosecutors in parts in this country that have the skills to actually investigate these things and make sure justice is being served.
Yeah. I need you to get, I got a little less than 2.5 minutes here with you, but I want to talk about Decolonizing Justice, that series, and what it means to you. So please take the time to share that too.
Definitely. Well, the first 3 or 4 minutes of the documentary called Bad Hombres, from criminalization to, Bad Hombres from colonization to criminalization, is footage, raw footage of encounters with police with unarmed Latino men and women throughout the country. One of them is Francisco Serna, the grandfather who was killed in Bakersfield, California. The cops claimed he had a gun in his hand. He had a crucifix. So Decolonize Justice basically is a film production that Latino Justice that we created to continue to expand the conversation about criminal justice reform, about the punishment industry. And what we put front and center are the faces and profiles of Latinas and Latinos who have also been ensnared in different ways by the criminal justice system. So we have a documentary about the history of violence and what's called settler colonialism in this country. Goes back to the days when white folk came to this country and they had, quote unquote, manifest destiny that they're going to occupy and exterminate everybody from sea to shining sea. And it starts from that premise, talks about the lynchings of Mexicanos throughout the Southwest, Texas, California, goes into modern day issues of gang policing, gang injunctions, the drug war, excessive profiling, stop and frisk. Then we have smaller 6-minute, 5-minute profiles. I got a brother right here in New York City where his name was on a gang database and what that meant to his livelihood. I got a sister in Arizona who talks about the issues of crimmigration. She was charged with an excessive drug possession charge, which then put her on a deportation fast track. And luckily she was out and still out. I got the family of Francisco Serna I got this young man in Miami who is a Latino, did 12 years inside, and the system told him he was white and would not let him change his racial designation, because in many states, Daren, they only report out who's white, who's black, and who's other.
Yeah, yeah.
So those are issues that we put a ball just to have a conversation with communities about what do these systems also mean, and why we as Latinx people in this country have to be in complete solidarity with our brothers and sisters in the African-American community to actually start dismantling this whole system and creating one that's transformative and restorative in its justice.
Yeah. Well, Juan, we got to leave it there, but thank you so much for sharing with us. I mean, got to have you back. We'll certainly have this conversation going as I know, and you know that you're a guy with boots on the ground, your organization with boots on the ground. There's so much that's happening that we can't even get it all in one segment. So we got to bring you back and continue talking about it. Juan Cartagena from the Latino Justice. Thank you so much for being with us here.
Take care.
All right.